All right, let's unpack this. In late 2025, a diplomatic spat between Asia's two biggest economies, China and Japan, it didn't just bubble up, it basically detonated.
It really did. This wasn't one of those slow-moving territorial disputes we're used to seeing.
No, this was a crisis that went from, sharp words and protests to full-blown military signaling, and this is the key part, severe, immediate economic retaliation, almost overnight.
Exactly. What we saw in the 2025-2026 China-Japan crisis, it just fundamentally rewrote the risk calculations for the entire region. So our mission today is to trace that incredible speed of escalation.
Right.
You need to really understand where this came from, the origin of the conflict, which is buried deep in Japan's evolving security doctrine. And then we need to analyze the sheer breadth of China's coercion playbook. And I mean, that playbook targeted everything.
Everything from like anime movies to global high-tech supply chains. And the centerpiece of that coercion, the real weapon that struck right at Japan's manufacturing core, was rare earth minerals. So this deep dive, it isn't just about looking back at history, it's about understanding a modern blueprint for how you weaponize economic power.
And this entire chain reaction, this whole crisis, was kicked off by one crucial and very politically charged statement.
Made by the Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi in the National Diet.
Yep. But before we can even appreciate how huge her statement was, we have to look at the massive constraints that Japanese defense policy operates under. I mean, you really have to understand the slow, decades-long evolution of Japan's security posture to get why her words landed like an existential threat in Beijing.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's revisit the foundation of modern Japanese defense. Since 1947, the country has operated under a constitution that's famous for Article 9.
Right, the so-called pacifist clause.
Exactly. It explicitly prohibits using force to resolve international disputes. For decades, this kept Japan's defense strategy purely self-defense oriented. It was all about protecting its own territory, and that's it.
But that pacifist stance has been chipping away for years. It's been driven by regional threats, primarily from China and, of course, North Korea.
And the really critical legal shift, the one that sets the stage for this whole crisis, that happened in 2015.
Under the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, with the passing of the legislation for peace and security.
That 2015 legislation was just pivotal. It was huge because it allowed Japan to engage in what's called collective self-defense,
Right.
which basically means Japan could, for the very first time since World War II, use military action to defend a close ally. And we're mostly talking about the United States here, even if Japan itself wasn't being directly attacked.
And this is where the very specific legal language becomes the flashpoint for the whole crisis. The legislation didn't just give them a blank check for global intervention.
Yeah.
Collective self-defense is only triggered by what the law calls a survival-threatening situation, or in Japanese, Zanritsu Kiki Jitai.
Okay, let's stop right there because that legal phrase, that's the whole pretext for everything that follows. What exactly does Zanritsu Kiki Jitai mean, and how is it different from what they had before?
Well, it's a very high bar, and that's intentional. It's defined as an armed attack on a close foreign country that, and this is the key part, threatens Japan's survival and poses a clear danger to its people.
Even if the attack doesn't target Japan directly.
Exactly. Before 2015, Japan operated under a much lower threshold called Juo Aikyo Jitai, which basically meant situations with a major impact on Japan's security.
And under that old rule, they could offer support but not fight.
Right. They could do things like refueling or medical aid for U.S. forces in the rear area, but they were strictly prohibited from actually using force.
So Takaichi wasn't just talking about offering logistical support. She was explicitly invoking this new, higher legal threshold that actually permits offensive military action in defense of an ally.
She was. She was signaling that Japan was legally positioning itself to join a fight, not just, help out from the sidelines.
Which is a massive shift.
It's a fundamental shift. And the context here just matters so much.
Yeah.
Enter Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi, elected in October 2025. She is widely known for being, let's say, hawkish on China.
Very hawkish. She mirrors the hardline wing of her party, the LDP. And she'd already gone on record saying that a Taiwan emergency is a Japan emergency, which was echoing a famous line from Abe.
And her election itself caused a huge political shockwave at home. Our sources noted that Komeito, the LDP's longtime coalition partner, actually broke away right after she took office.
Why was that domestic political shift so important for the international picture?
Because Komeito, which is backed by the Buddhist organization Soka Gakkai, has historically been the dovish check on the LDP. They're the ones who are known for pushing for dialogue with Beijing, for friendly engagement.
The brakes on the hardliners.
The brakes. Exactly. Their departure from the ruling coalition was a signal that the era of pragmatic, economically focused engagement with China was over. It meant Takaichi now had the political runway to take a much harder line. And Beijing saw this. They saw this internal shift as an immediate threat to the status quo.
And the relationship was already on thin ice. I mean, China's leader, Xi Jinping, didn't even send a congratulatory telegram when she was elected.
No. And while they held a summit on October 31st, that thaw was very, very brief. Takaichi met with Taiwan's former vice premier on November 1st, and that prompted an immediate protest from China, which Japan just refused to accept. The diplomatic temperature was just soaring.
So the powder keg was ready.
And Takaichi provided the match on November 7, 2025. She was in the middle of deliberations in the National Diet, and she was responding to a question from an opposition parliamentarian, Katsuya Okada.
And he was asking about a very specific military scenario.
A crucial one.
Yeah.
A hypothetical naval blockade of the Bashi Channel.
For anyone listening, this channel is the vital waterway between the Philippines and Taiwan. Why is that specific channel so important to Japan?
It's the jugular vein of Japan's economy. Simple as that. The vast majority of its energy imports, its commercial shipping, the lifeblood of the nation, it all travels through the Bashi Channel or the nearby Miyako Strait.
So Okada's question was pretty clever. He asked if a mere blockade, where ships could, technically go the long way around, even if it's way more expensive, would that truly meet the definition of a survival-threatening situation?
And Takaichi's response was definitive. She stated unequivocally that a Chinese attack on Taiwan, particularly one involving the use of force in those sea lanes, could constitute an existential crisis for Japan under that 2015 law.
Wow.
And then she clarified, just to seal it, if it were to involve the use of warships in the exercise of force, then by any measure it could constitute a situation threatening Japan's survival. By invoking Zanritsu Kikijitai, she crossed the most sensitive political and legal red line there is.
She was signaling Japan's potential for kinetic intervention in a Taiwan conflict.
She was. And the reaction from Beijing was immediate, it was personal, and it was shockingly aggressive.
The very next day,
the Chinese consul general in Osaka, a man named Xu Jian, used the social media platform X to post a chilling, visceral threat. And he wrote it in fluent Japanese.
And the language he used was it was horrific.
It was. He wrote, "We have no choice but to cut off that dirty neck that has lunged at us without a moment's hesitation. Are you ready?"
That's not diplomatic language. That's the language of a threat of violence, of assassination, delivered by a high-ranking diplomat.
Absolutely. And while he later deleted the post after a massive public outcry in Japan, the damage was already done. Japan's government called his comments extremely inappropriate and demanded China take appropriate measures.
But China didn't. They dug in.
They dug in hard. They refused to reprimand him. Instead, they condemned Takaichi's remarks as blatant interference in their internal affairs, a violation of the One China principle. They demanded a retraction.
And Takaichi, seeing how much was at stake, refused to withdraw her remarks. She argued they were consistent with the government's established position.
And that refusal, right there, made the crisis inevitable.
Takaichi's refusal to back down, that was the signal that this wasn't going to be some simple diplomatic hiccup that gets resolved quietly.
Not at all. The dispute immediately moved into this highly confrontational and frankly pretty humiliating phase of diplomatic exchange all through November.
And it started with a volley of mutual summons.
Right. On November 13th, China's Deputy Foreign Minister, Sun Weidong, summons the Japanese ambassador, Kenji Kanasugi, to deliver an official protest.
And Kanasugi didn't just take it. He used the opportunity to not only reject their argument, but to firmly protest the consul general's violent threat.
And Japan fired right back. The very next day, Japan's Vice Minister Takahiro Funakoshi summons the Chinese ambassador, Wu Jiangao, to protest the same things again.
But Ambassador Wu used his platform to escalate, didn't he?
He did. He warned that Takaichi's comments were a complete misjudgment of the situation and an overestimation of Japan's capabilities.
So that wasn't just a protest, that was psychological pressure. He was basically saying, if you act on this new doctrine, you're going to face consequences you can't handle.
Exactly. And Funakoshi's response was, measured but firm. He reaffirmed Japan's consistent policy, making it clear they weren't backing down from the ultimatum.
Which led to a stalemate and then this meeting between the director generals of the two foreign ministries on November 18th.
Liu Jinsong of China met with Masaki Kanai of Japan. But this meeting, it became less about actual dialogue and much more about optics.
Yes, and this is where China used what you can only call a textbook maneuver of symbolic humiliation.
It really was. Our sources highlight this very unusual step the Chinese side took. They allowed reporters and state media photographers inside the ministry to capture the scene.
Which is highly irregular for that level of discussion.
Very. And the pictures that came out were calculated for maximum impact. The photos that Chinese state media pushed out showed their guy, Liu Jinsong, wearing this severe Chinese tunic suit, national emblem pinned on his chest, speaking forcefully, head held high.
And the Japanese counterpart, Kanai, was photographed listening with his head down.
The message couldn't be clearer. China is the dominant party dictating terms, and Japan is the passive one receiving instruction.
And Japanese media and officials saw this immediately for what it was.
Oh, absolutely. They saw it as China trying to manipulate public opinion and humiliate Japan on the world stage. Japan's chief cabinet secretary, Minoru Kihara, even formally protested the unilateral photography. It was a clear sign the diplomatic aim had shifted from negotiation to public shaming.
And China wasn't satisfied with just bilateral scolding. They immediately took the fight global, using the United Nations as their next stage.
Right. On November 18, the very same day as that humiliating meeting, China's UN representative Fu Kong used a General Assembly session on Security Council reform to launch a broadside against Japan.
And the choice of venue there is strategically fascinating.
It is. Because the UN Security Council reform debate is where you do high-stakes geopolitical positioning. Fu Kong stated boldly that Japan was totally unqualified to demand a permanent seat on the Security Council.
So this went way beyond Taiwan. This was an attack on Japan's entire global political ambition.
And then they followed it up with formal documentation. On November 22nd, Fu delivered a letter to the UN Secretary-General, Antonio Guterres, for all member states to see.
And that letter leveled a much more serious legal accusation.
It did. The letter claimed that if Japan were to intervene militarily in a Taiwan conflict, acting on Takaichi's doctrine, it would constitute an act of aggression under the UN Charter, and China would therefore exercise its right of self-defense.
That is a brilliant move, framing a U.S. treaty ally as the potential aggressor in the eyes of the world.
And Japan, of course, reacted swiftly. Their foreign ministry called the claim entirely unacceptable. 2 days later, their UN ambassador, Kazuyuki Yamazaki, sent his own letter calling China's assertions erroneous and skillfully redirecting attention back to China's own rapid military buildup.
So the UN basically became the stage for this prolonged, intense historical debate that went on all through December.
It did. Fu Kong fired back on December 1st, calling Takaichi's statement the greatest challenge to relations, and calling on everyone to remain highly vigilant against Japan's ambitions to revive militarism.
And there's that phrase again. It's clear China's strategy was to anchor this modern crisis firmly in the past.
Constantly, they repeatedly criticized Japan for reviving militarism, tying Takaichi's very real present-day security concerns directly to Japan's actions in World War II. It forced Japan to constantly be on the defensive, refuting these accusations.
It was a comprehensive diplomatic siege designed to undermine Japan's credibility on the world stage. So once the diplomatic pressure failed to get Takaichi to retract her statement, China quickly changed tactics. They showed they were willing to impose real, immediate costs on Japan.
Yeah, this is where it moved from just talk to a full-spectrum demonstration of military and economic pressure.
Let's start with the kinetic stuff, the military saber-rattling. What did that look like?
Our sources confirm a very rapid acceleration of military activity right after Takaichi's comments. Between November 17th and 19th, the PLA conducted live-fire exercises in the central Yellow Sea.
And Taiwan immediately called them out on it.
They did. They issued a strong condemnation, saying Beijing was explicitly saber-rattling at Japan for political gain.
And at the same time, they were deliberately ramping up tensions around the disputed Senkaku Islands.
Right. China Coast Guard ships patrolled inside the territorial waters on November 16th. Then on December 2nd, you had a more aggressive standoff, where Chinese and Japanese Coast Guard vessels confronted each other over a Japanese fishing boat. It's this kind of consistent, low-level harassment that challenges Japan's control and just drains their resources.
But the naval maneuvers got really serious in early December.
They did. The aircraft carrier Liaoning transited the crucial Miyako Strait from December 6th to 7th. And the important detail here isn't just that it went through, it's the intensity of the operations. The carrier conducted roughly 100 takeoff and landing drills with its J-15 jets in just 2 days.
That kind of sustained air operation so close to Japan's air defense zone is a serious show of power, but the tension really spiked with a formal protest from Japan over two incidents on December 6th.
Indeed. These were the incidents where Chinese J-15 jets locked their fire control radar onto Japanese F-15 jets.
And for anyone listening, a radar lock is not an accident.
No, it is the final preparatory step before you fire a missile. It's a direct threat of lethal force.
So that takes the whole conflict out of the realm of politics and into immediate operational risk. How did Japan and its allies respond to that specific act?
Japan's defense minister, Shinjiro Koizumi, accused China of a deliberate provocation. Takaichi called the actions extremely disappointing. But what makes the whole thing even more serious is a critical failure in communication.
The hotline.
The hotline. Japanese officials later confirmed that the dedicated China-Japan military hotline, which was set up specifically to prevent accidental conflict, went unanswered during this high-tension incident.
Let's just unpack that for a second. A non-functioning hotline during a near miss is terrifying. What does that signal strategically?
It signals a total lack of commitment from the Chinese side to de-escalation when they're actively trying to coerce you. The whole point of that line is to allow immediate communication when your pilots are locking weapons onto each other. Its failure means if someone had made a mistake, there would have been no way to prevent an immediate accidental escalation to war.
It shows they were willing to push right up to the edge of disaster to make their point.
Exactly. And to counter this, the U.S. immediately reinforced the alliance. First, Chinese and Russian bombers flew a joint patrol through the Miyako Strait on December 9th. The very next day, the U.S. responded with B-52s flying alongside Japanese F-35s and F-15s, a clear, coordinated show of force.
And China wrapped up the year by announcing a major Justice Mission 2025 exercises around Taiwan on December 29th, just to keep the pressure on.
But the PLA was just one tool in the kit. China also reached for cultural and economic weapons, which really shows how comprehensive their retaliation can be. It hit Japanese society across the board.
This is where you see the sheer breadth of the coercion. The culture war was instant. The big Tokyo-Beijing forum, which is supposed to foster understanding, was postponed indefinitely.
Right. And then Japanese films that were scheduled for release in China, like Crayon Shin-chan and the popular anime Cells at Work, they had their releases postponed by the government, citing the need to reassess Chinese audience sentiment.
Convenient excuse.
Very. And the impact on live events was just widespread and very targeted. Estimates suggest around 30 live performances and fan events by Japanese performers were canceled.
We're not just talking about huge artists, right?
No, it was groups like JO1, singers like Kokia. Ayumi Hamasaki's Shanghai concert was canceled, which led to that very symbolic and viral moment of her performing to an empty stadium.
And even went into niche interests. An anime event in Shanghai was disrupted when a singer's performance was just cut off mid-song. Lights and sound gone. The Studio Ghibli exhibition in Guangzhou canceled. Even a big Pokemon card game tournament in Shanghai was postponed.
And the cultural boycott also showed a deeper strategic point, which is China's ability to exert influence across borders. We saw a ripple effect hit K-pop.
How so?
Events for popular groups that had Japanese members like Close Your Eyes and Los Seraphim, they were canceled, or the Japanese members were sidelined for any promotions in China. It shows that even third-country entertainment that relies on the Chinese market is vulnerable.
And then there was the symbolic heartbreak. The two beloved pandas at Ueno Zoo.
Xiao Xiao and Lei Lei. It was announced they would return to China in January 2026, ahead of schedule. Now, technically, they were on loan, but accelerating their departure was a very high-profile public sign of frozen relations. It was aimed right at Japanese public sentiment.
But the most immediate economic shock came from tourism and travel.
Absolutely. China is Japan's biggest source of foreign tourists and students, which makes it a perfect target for coercion. On November 14th, the government just advised its citizens to avoid travel to Japan.
And that advisory triggered a massive logistical meltdown.
It did. Chinese airlines immediately offered free refunds for Japan flights through the end of the year, a policy they later extended for 3 more months. And multiple reports suggested airlines were informally told by the government to just slash the number of flights to Japan through March 2026.
So they basically cut off the flow.
They cut off the flow. And the economic damage was swift and it was staggering. By November 20th, analysts estimated 543,000 airline tickets had been canceled. That's 40% of all bookings from China.
Wow.
Initial estimates projected a loss of between $500 million and $1.2 billion in the short term. But the longer it went on, the projections got worse. They were looking at potential losses of over $11 billion. That's 1.79 trillion yen, or 0.29% of Japan's GDP.
So this intentional weaponization of consumer choice was a clear message.
A very clear message. And as Chinese tourists canceled Japan, bookings for places like South Korea and Russia surged. So it's a dual purpose.
Yeah.
You punish the target, and you reward your geopolitical partners who toe the line.
While the cultural and travel bans were fast and painful, the most strategically concerning escalation, the one that really targets the future of Japan's high-tech economy, that came in January 2026.
Right. This is where the economic war truly hardened and revealed Japan's deep strategic vulnerability.
This came after some smaller things, like China halting seafood imports and suspending beef export talks in late November. But the focus sharpened dramatically on high-tech trade right after the new year.
On January 6, 2026, China's Ministry of Commerce announced a ban on exporting all dual-use items to Japan if those items were destined for military use.
And dual use is a deliberately broad term.
It's incredibly broad. It covers a huge range of goods, software, technologies that have both civilian and military applications. So we're talking about anything from critical minerals used in semiconductors and drones to, advanced optics. And because it's often hard to prove the final application, the vagueness of the ban is what makes it such a powerful weapon.
And Chief Cabinet Secretary Minoru Kihara's response was very telling. He called it discriminatory and absolutely unacceptable. But then he admitted they weren't sure exactly which items were even targeted.
And that uncertainty is the goal. It paralyzes the Japanese manufacturing sector. I mean, how do you plan production when you have no idea which crucial part is going to be blocked tomorrow?
And China immediately doubled down on semiconductor pressure.
The very next day, the Commerce Ministry launched an anti-dumping investigation into Japanese imports of dichlorosilane. Now, this sounds very technical, but it's a move that hits a really crucial industrial node.
Okay, so dichlorosilane, that sounds like jargon. Why is that specific chemical important enough to get hit with an anti-dumping probe right in the middle of this crisis?
Dichlorosilane is a high-purity chemical that's absolutely essential for making silicon wafers. It's a key ingredient for producing advanced semiconductors. So by launching an anti-dumping probe, which claims Japan is selling it too cheaply, China is creating the legal groundwork to slap on massive tariffs or quotas.
Which would disrupt the supply chain for Japanese chip makers.
Exactly. And their crucial equipment suppliers. It's a way of punishing them directly for Takaichi's political stance.
So this combination, a vague dual-use ban plus a very targeted probe on a specific chemical, that shows a remarkable level of sophistication.
It does. But the single greatest threat, the one that underpins all of this, remains the rare earth vulnerability.
This is the strategic Achilles heel.
It is. China dominates the global rare earth supply chain. They control nearly 70% of production and, critically, over 90% of the refining capacity. And that's the key. It's not just about digging rocks out of the ground. It's about the complex, dirty, and essential processing that makes them usable.
Japan has spent 15 years trying to get away from this dependence, especially since the last crisis in 2010. They've reduced their reliance from nearly 90% down to about 60–70% today.
But even at 60%, they're still critically exposed.
And that exposure is concentrated in the most important elements, right?
It's concentrated in the rarest and most strategically vital ones, the heavy rare earths. Specifically, we're talking about dysprosium and terbium. And for those, Japan remains almost completely dependent on China.
So why are dysprosium and terbium so strategically critical? Why are they so hard to replace?
It really comes down to physics and performance, especially in high-performance magnets. Dysprosium and terbium are added to these magnets to significantly increase their heat resistance.
So without them, the magnets lose their strength when they get hot.
Right. And that is vital for high-performance electric vehicle motors, which generate a ton of heat. It's also crucial for wind turbines and, of course, advanced defense systems, precision-guided missiles, specialized sensors. Without Chinese heavy rare earths, Japanese manufacturers simply cannot maintain the performance needed to stay competitive in these key sectors. They are, for now, completely irreplaceable.
And that explains the market reaction. This whole crisis immediately brought back memories of the 2010 Senkaku Islands dispute, which was the first time China really weaponized this dominance.
It was. And China learned some very important lessons from that 2010 event that they're applying now.
What were those lessons?
Well, in 2010, China didn't issue a formal ban. They just slowed things down. They used opaque, drawn-out customs and licensing procedures. It was a proof of concept that worked perfectly. It created crippling uncertainty for Japanese industry and forced Japan to release the Chinese fishing boat captain very quickly.
So they learned that ambiguity and bureaucratic delay can be more effective than a formal ban that you might get challenged on at the WTO.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
And so experts believe China is using a more refined version of that tactic in 2026, the backdoor export ban.
So instead of a big headline-grabbing ban, they're threatening to use these lengthy screening processes tied to the new dual-use rule.
Exactly. To make sure the materials aren't being used for military purposes, supposedly.
Yeah.
But in reality, these delays stop Japanese manufacturers from getting what they need for their commercial lines, creating chaos in their supply chains.
And the stock market reacted instantly. It quantified the risk in real time. Japanese defense stocks like Kawasaki Heavy and Mitsubishi Heavy, they fell right after the threat was made.
But the true measure of the anxiety was the jump in non-Chinese suppliers.
Right.
Australia's Lynas Rare Earths saw its stock surge a dramatic 14.5% on January 7th. That confirms the market sees supply chains outside of China as a premium secure asset. It's literally pricing in the geopolitical risk of relying on Beijing.
And the economic cost projections show why everyone was panicking.
Yeah, the analysis estimated that a 3-month curb, like what happened in 2010, could cost Japanese businesses over $4.2 billion and shave 0.11% off Japan's annual GDP. A year-long ban could knock off almost 0.5%. These numbers just confirm that economic dependence on heavy rare earths is a direct, measurable national security risk.
So this pressure basically forces Japan's hand toward these extremely ambitious and very high-risk countermeasures.
So the strategy now is twofold. Massive diversification, which they've been doing, and attempting to develop their own domestic source in the most challenging environment you can possibly imagine.
And that brings us to the deep-sea mining project near Minamotori Island. What is the scale of this thing?
It's a monumental technical challenge. Starting in January 2026, Japan is set to test the world's first attempt to continuously lift rare earth-rich mud from a depth of 6,000 meters.
6,000 meters. That's deeper than the Grand Canyon is wide.
It is. They know the deposit is massive. It could potentially supply Japan with heavy rare earths for centuries. This test is a huge government-backed project aimed at proving the technology can work, and maybe even collaborating with the U.S. on it in the future.
So securing these critical minerals far from China's geopolitical leverage sounds like the perfect solution. But achieving that independence by digging 6,000 meters down, that involves a massive environmental trade-off, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Japan is actively trading geopolitical risk for environmental risk. I mean, while the project is necessary for their strategic security, environmental groups are sounding the alarm. They warn of long-lasting damage to these poorly understood deep-sea ecosystems, potentially destroying unique biodiversity. They're calling for a global moratorium on deep-sea mining until the impact is actually understood.
So the crisis forced Japan to manage this intense domestic fallout while at the same time navigating a divided and often pretty quiet international community.
Right. Domestically, there was a very visible and potentially damaging political split over Takaichi's decision to use such provocative language in the first place.
And even within her own party, the LDP, there was friction.
Immediate friction. While Takaichi refused to retract the statement, he had former Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, a real political veteran, criticizing her remarks as not conducive to enhancing Japan's deterrence capabilities.
What did he mean by that exactly? What was his criticism?
Well, seasoned politicians like Ishiba and Abe, before the 2015 law, they understood the strategic value of ambiguity when it comes to Taiwan. They always wanted China to have to calculate the risk of Japanese intervention, but they never wanted to provide the legal certainty that Takaichi did.
So by being so specific, she actually gave China a clearer target.
That's Ishiba's argument. By explicitly defining the Bashi Channel blockade as a Zanritsu Kikijitai, she basically told China, if you keep your intervention below that use of force threshold, our hands are tied. He felt this specificity actually damaged Japan's long-term deterrence by giving away the national red line.
And the political damage got even worse when it came out that her statement was unscripted.
Yeah, that was highly damaging. A CDP opposition lawmaker got a copy of the testimony script prepared for Takaichi, and it showed the planned response was simply to decline to comment on hypothetical situations.
So this confirmed she knowingly went off script to make this definitive, provocative stance.
It did. It suggested she was prioritizing her political image as a hawk over the careful diplomatic consensus of previous cabinets. And this just fueled the opposition parties, who, while they were condemning the Chinese diplomats' threats, were also urging her to retract the statement because of the real economic damage it was causing.
And during this time, we also saw the highly concerning, though quickly denied, nuclear question pop up.
Right. An unnamed official in the Prime Minister's office apparently suggested Japan should consider acquiring nuclear weapons.
And even if that was just a leak from a rogue element, it shows the extreme security anxiety that was running through Tokyo after the radar lock and the hotline failure.
It does. China reacted extremely strongly to the rumor, and the Japanese government had to swiftly and formally reaffirm its long-standing non-nuclear weapons policy. But the episode just highlighted how desperate some people were getting.
Okay, let's turn to Japan's most critical ally, the United States. The U.S. response was full of mixed signals, and it caused a lot of frustration in Tokyo.
Deep frustration and disappointment. Initially, the U.S. government offered very little public support from the highest levels, just silence.
Which must have been profoundly disappointing for Japanese officials.
It was. Now, the U.S. ambassador, George Edward Glass, he was very forthright. He strongly condemned the dirty neck comment, and he forcefully reaffirmed the U.S. treaty commitment to Japan's security, including the Senkakus. But the Japanese government felt that wasn't enough.
They were frustrated that a strong statement only came from a State Department spokesperson and the ambassador, not from, the president or the Secretary of State.
Right. And then you had the Trump factor, which just complicated everything. President Trump held back-to-back calls with Xi Jinping and Takaichi on November 24th.
And what did those calls signal to Tokyo?
Well, the public readout of the Xi call was just devastating to Japanese morale. It emphasized extremely strong China relations, it focused on trade and fentanyl, and it completely omitted any mention of Japan or Taiwan.
So it was perceived in Tokyo as a clear public deprioritization of a crisis affecting a treaty ally.
Absolutely. And then reports started suggesting that during his call with Takaichi, President Trump had advised her to not escalate tensions and to lower the volume.
And while Japan's government denied the specific advice was given,
the perception that Washington was prioritizing its own stability with Beijing over publicly defending a key ally in a crisis, that caused significant Japanese frustration. It raised a fundamental question in Tokyo. Does the U.S. alliance protect Japan's right to define its own security interests, or just its physical borders? The silence suggested the U.S. would defend the latter, but not necessarily the former.
And internationally, the support was clearly divided along geopolitical lines.
It was. You had a chorus of countries like Cambodia, Laos, Pakistan, Russia, North Korea, all firmly reaffirming their adherence to the One China policy.
And Russia was particularly vocal.
Which shouldn't be a surprise, given their strategic partnership with Beijing. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, urged Japan to think carefully before heading towards militarization, and they released a joint statement with China opposing any revival of Japanese militarism. China successfully mobilized its partners to support its narrative.
And finally, the crisis exposed the immense strategic vulnerability of Japan's key neighbor, South Korea.
Oh, massively. Seoul depends on China for nearly 90% of its rare earth raw materials. That's an even higher reliance than Japan's.
And the timing of China's actions relative to South Korea seems very calculated.
Highly calculated. China timed its dual-use ban announcement to happen during South Korean President Lee Jae-myung's state visit to China. This was a clear tactical move designed to drive a wedge between Seoul and Tokyo. It was a reminder to South Korea that they share the same critical dependency.
And while President Lee said the country wouldn't take sides, but offered to mediate,
the underlying message to Seoul was chilling. Similar, comprehensive retaliation could easily be aimed at you if you take steps we don't like, especially on Taiwan. It was a demonstration of regional coercive power aimed at managing the alliance behavior of both Japan and Korea at the same time.
And what about Western allies?
Lukewarm support at best. Australia expressed concern over the military actions, specifically the radar lock incident. But the UK and most of Europe, they generally avoided commenting directly on Japan's diplomacy and just called for dialogue. This just reinforced the feeling in Tokyo that at the highest levels of global diplomacy, they were pretty isolated.
So, after all of that, what does this all mean for the future of geopolitics in Asia? The 2025-2026 crisis wasn't just a static event. It was, a live demonstration of a full playbook.
It really was. It showed that China is willing to use every single tool of coercion, from the immediate military danger of radar locks and failed hotlines, to symbolic humiliation, cultural boycotts, tourism bans, and most critically, the strategic weaponization of their supply chain dominance to enforce its red line on Taiwan.
The primary takeaway for Tokyo has to be that economic dependence is now a direct, quantifiable national security risk.
Without a doubt. The cost of speech, when it's about Taiwan, is measured not just in diplomatic protests, but in billions of yen lost and major disruptions across society. The whole Japanese concept of security must now fully integrate economic resilience.
And Japan's counter-strategy is incredibly ambitious. Diversification, localization, and this massive, risky gamble on deep-sea mining.
They're pouring resources into trying to overcome the technical hurdles of pulling heavy rare earths from 6,000 meters beneath the Pacific, all in the hope of mitigating that reliance on China.
Which brings us to the final, provocative thought for you to consider. This complex, expensive, and environmentally risky extraction process is necessary for Japan to secure the heavy rare earths used in advanced defense systems and high-performance tech.
So the question is, if this deep-sea mining effort fails to scale commercially, or if the mounting environmental opposition forces a regulatory stop, what kind of geopolitical leverage will China gain in the coming decade?
Yeah.
How that continued near-monopolistic control over essential heavy rare earths further constrain the foreign policy and security decisions of U.S. allies all across Asia? The future of high-tech manufacturing and maybe even regional stability could very well rest 6,000 meters beneath the Pacific.